the way Andy and I decided to frame this was to talk about what maybe a historian would be thinking about when they looked back at the news from 2023, 50 or 100 years from now. Now, that assumes there's still humans and historians 100 years from now, and assumes that we in 2023 might be able to figure out what they're going to be thinking about.
So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out and joining us today as we end the year. And for Minerva Academy of Lifelong Learning, which David and I started a few years ago, this is a very important meeting of the minds, because we really looking forward to, there is so much news. And there is such a bombardment of news from all angles that we just can't discern what's going on. So many important events happened. And one of the things that I thought of doing was to bring these amazing minds together and go over some of the things that happened, and also to be able to look at some of the nice things that may have happened amongst all the debacles that are going on around us. So with that, I'm going to ask David, my favorite professor in the world, to share some of the news. I think David has like a beautiful spread of slides, and let's see if we can, he'll share the screen with us. And if there is like any questions you guys have, I'm going to mute everyone so that we can just focus on David and Andy going off on different things. So we have like a bunch of questions.
I think everybody is muted already, so we don't need to mess around with that. The only thing I'll say is, and we intend this to be a salon. Andy and I like to talk, and so we will probably not let you get a word in edgewise unless you unmute yourself and say something or raise your hand or put something in the chat bar. But as much as we like to talk, we also love to be in dialogue. And so please don't hesitate. Whenever you have something to say, question to ask, comment to make, disagreement to register, please let us know. And so having said that, I think everybody knows Sophia, me, I hope also Andrew Rosenthal, former editor of the New York Times opinion section and practically a Swiss Army knife of American journalism, has done an awful lot from reporting from Russia to many places in the world to lots of domestic coverage, including some really important elections, and played many different roles at the New York Times. So, and now a colleague of mine at Sarah Lawrence as well. So, having said all of that, let's jump in. And the way Andy and I decided to frame this was to talk about what maybe a historian would be thinking about when they looked back at the news from 2023, 50 or 100 years from now. Now, that assumes there's still humans and historians 100 years from now, and assumes that we in 2023 might be able to figure out what they're going to be thinking about. And I'll just point out, right, that probably the more interesting way to do this, which we didn't do, would be to talk about the historians' debate about what was interesting in 2023. But we came up with a few different themes, and I'm just going to jump right in with Andy. So the images reflect what's happening in Israel and Gaza, the terrible Canadian wildfires, and the choking pollution much of North America suffered as a result. And that stuff I expect that historians actually will be paying attention to. And then maybe not so much Joe Biden's approval rating, which is abysmal, and as bad as any incumbent president in since we've been doing this kind of polling, and then inflation having come under control, at least for the time being. And so the first question, and I'm eager to
Which one
hear
was the inflation slide?
reflections. What's that, Sophia?
Which one was the inflation slide?
The inflation slide was the top
The
left
jaggedy one.
the
Oh,
cursor is, and it came
oh,
back under control in 2023 after having been
oh,
as
oh.
high
And there is
as
like this other graph,
the other
and there
graph
is
is
other.
the Biden approval rating or disapproval rating, would be the better way to put it. Um,
Hmm.
so let's start with AI. And the question we want to discuss is, was this the year humans lost control of AI? Andy, you want to start us out on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, right? Because did humans ever really try to get control of AI? A lot of the questions they're going to be asking today are, did it happen or did we just admit it, right? So I think this is the year that AI exploded as a development thing and a business thing online, and regular people started to understand what AI meant, and not just the ones like me who had been watching science fiction since they were 10 years old and have been dreading this moment their entire lives. So I don't know if we ever had control of it, to be honest. But yes, this is the year in which we started treating AI the same way we treated most other developments online, which is to say, without any sense of what we're doing, without any plan, without any understanding of what's going on. You know, as you know, we went into the era of Google and the rest of them by giving them total legal immunity from everything. And as a result of that, we are suffering the consequences right now. And the question about AI is, you know, is it a toy? Is it amazing? Is it cute? Is it going to be like Google Glass and go away in a year? I don't think so. But we haven't, as certainly our society. I'm not sure what's happening in other countries, but in the United States, there isn't so far any real coherent attempt to figure out how we're going to control this and to declare it a public utility. That's the most important thing that has to happen. In my mind, one of the greatest mistakes we made as a society was deciding that the internet was not a public utility, like the telephone lines or the railroads or whatever the rest of it. And the consequences of that have been extreme. And I'm afraid we're going down the same path. So I would agree. Yes, 2023 was the chance that we had a chance to exercise control of it, and either didn't try well enough or lost control of it. Yes.
Yeah.
What do you mean by making it a public utility?
Let me go back in time a tiny bit, right? We're all familiar with radio and television, right? Radio and television exist on limited wave bands, or they change, they expand all the time, but basically it's limited. And ever since there's been radio and television of any, you know, significance, the government has controlled the access to it and has made requirements of the people who access it. Now, some of those controls come and some of them go, but it allows the society to have a say in what is transmitted over those lines. Back about 20, 25 years ago, there was a question about how are we going to handle this wireless, and how are we going to handle the internet? Was it a public utility? Was it like a highway? Was it like a railroad? Was it like the electric lines that come into your house? All of which have there is a public interest in, and the government exercises some form of regulation or control over. A decision was made when a bill was passed called the Communications Decency Act, or the Decency in Communications Act. I can't remember because, like all laws, it's the exact opposite of what the name is. And there's a section in it that says that people who do aggregation, people who do search, people who do the things online that we are now familiar with, that some of the biggest companies on earth are doing, Meta, Google, Amazon, those people bear no legal or moral responsibility for what they transmit to their users. None, zero. You can't sue them. And you can't regulate them, and you can't tell them what to do. And as a result, we now have these ridiculous conversations about whether or not it's okay for Elon Musk to let Donald Trump and other fascists back on Twitter. Sorry, X. Or is YouTube required to screen out offensive material? Now, I'm not talking about child pornography and other things that by themselves are illegal. But remember, if YouTube transmits child pornography, the person who creates the child pornography is guilty, and the person who watches it is guilty, but YouTube is not. YouTube is a
And
bad example
I'm
of
going
that.
to agree and disagree with Andy. I
Okay,
absolutely
good.
agree that this needs to be regulated, right? Artificial intelligence needs to be regulated. Online content creation needs to be regulated. Digital media needs to be regulated. And I'm going to point to, I think, a book and an image. The book is Neil Postman's Technopoly, and the claim that he made, and this goes back to the 1980s, I think, is when he wrote that book.
Yeah.
That America and much of the Western world, and now I think we would just say much of the world, have become technopolies in the sense of being societies in which we are ruled by our technology. We go where our technology takes us. We don't try to exercise any control over our technology. And he points out how strange and anomalous this is, that almost every other culture regulated its technology ethically and only used technology if they concluded that it was compatible with their central values, right? And we don't even ask that question. We just go wherever our technology leads us. And so the image is the famous Mickey Mouse image from Fantasia, the Sorcerer's Apprentice, being trampled by his own invention, right? Having bewitched the brooms, they then end up nearly drowning him. And we are being stampeded by our technology and very rarely making any effort to control it. And if we continue down that path, we will certainly lose control of AI. And I want to maybe differentiate a little bit the nature of social media, for instance, which I think I want to embrace the idea that the medium is the message. It's not the case that it's a neutral conduit for human communication. It's shaped the way in which we communicate. It's dumbed us down and made us much more susceptible to emotional manipulation via algorithms, much more detached from reality, much less likely to be able to form a consensus on even matters of basic fact. But having said all of that, social media does not think for itself, does
No.
not generate its own content, and AI does all of that, right?
Well,
Where
but the people who run social media do. The algorithms on social media, they don't think independently like AI might be able to, but they are very much deliberately intended to create content.
and by the way, to the extent that we've been using Facebook or YouTube or Twitter or X, Sophia's going to have to help me out. What am I missing? TikTok.
God.
Yes.
TikTok,
We're
Telegram.
already using artificial intelligence because all of their algorithms are driven by artificial
Right.
intelligence to figure out what's trending and what's holding attention and what's capturing your eyes. But having said all of that, where I disagree with you, Andy, is that the model of regulating public utilities is the right model for regulating
Okay, fair enough.
this new technology. And here's the claim, right? If you look back at radio,
No,
you
but
look
I don't. My question is that when you try to regulate, when you're saying some regulations on a public utility, are we talking about regulating their price, or are we talking about where their reach, or like who uses them?
No, it's more. Let me
What is
clarify
the
one thing.
regulation? Because like
I'm
in
not
Pakistan, you cannot use any of the social media. They can close it for you.
right. First of all, social media are not. Facebook is not really a public space. It's actually a private space, and so is Twitter. That's why the whole argument about Donald Trump's free speech being abridged by Twitter made me laugh uproariously, because it's just absurd. My main problem is responsibility. What comes with the regulation of the public utilities is the responsibility of the people who are allowed and who pay to regulate them. Pay to get access to them. That they have responsibility. That X and Meta, X and Facebook, are legally responsible for what they publish. They are publishers. They are not passive conduits of information as if they're just a wire that you run electricity through. They are publishers, just like the New York Times was a publisher. And if we published a lie, we could be held accountable for it. If Twitter publishes a lie, they get complimented on it.
On the one hand, I completely agree with Andy's criticism of the relevant section of the Decency and Communication Act, which I'm not remembering, but we could look it up easily. There's a section that essentially explicitly exempts these new media from liability for defamation, for false information, etc. It all falls to the producer. And of course, there's an awful lot of content that is produced anonymously or in which the people who produce it work very hard to cover their tracks, so you can't even figure out who it is to hold them liable. By the way, there's an important lawsuit that'll be perhaps adjudicated in 2024, where the New York Times is actually suing some of the AI generators for copyright infringement, for basically stealing its content. But here, Andy, is where I want to just drill down for a second. The thing about radio and television is they essentially stayed the way they were in terms of the political economy of communication, in terms of the way in which content was produced for a decade or sometimes longer, right?
More.
The issue with AI and the new media that rely on AI is that they change, and I want to say monthly. You know, they change so fast that they're going to be very hard to regulate if we stick with an old school model of regulation. And so part of the challenge is going to be figuring out how to have regulation that evolves as quickly and is as nimble as the technology we're trying to regulate. And that's a really tricky question. And it comes in an environment in which we've been anti-regulatory for 30 years, right? And so we haven't even 40 years. Okay, so we haven't even tried to really regulate in the old style for a very long time. And we need an entirely different approach to regulation. I do think there's some good ideas out there, and they involve much greater collaboration between the companies producing this technology and the regulators regulating it, as opposed to them being completely separate and opposed. They need to be directly transparent, involved. Government needs to give the industries certain advantages for coming into the regulatory regime in exchange for the industries saying to the government, by the way, this is the new technology we're working on today. It's not out there yet. And on the other hand, this is what we're worried about. And I take a little bit of comfort from the fact that most of the large AI companies actually came to DC to meet with Biden and basically said, regulate us, right? They didn't say, right, we want aggressive regulation. They said, we want very modest, voluntary regulation. But when is the last time an industry came to DC and said, regulate us, please, right?
So I have an example.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so going back a bit to the explosion of wireless and the internet, Verizon and Google got together to argue that the internet should be free. Not free. The internet's not free in that sense, but in other words, it should be unregulated. And there was a big kind of
neutrality.
Content, right. But they've departed on the question of wireless, obviously, because Google had no interest in wireless, and Verizon's entire business is in wireless, right? So there are examples of it. The other thing that we have is that traditionally in our country, what we've done is we've taken the regulated industries and let them write the regulations, and that's a problem. And we can't afford to do that now. Whether or not I trust these people is a separate question. Maybe we don't need to get into, but I think you're absolutely right. It has to be dual, because we can't see this stuff, right? It's easy to hide. And it's proprietary, it's this, it's that, it's the other thing, right? And there has to be some understanding that the basic mechanics of AI are not proprietary to any particular company, right? That's something that serves society. And we have to get out of the business of privatizing everything. We have been privatizing everything from prisons to spaceflight. And I think it's a terrible mistake. And okay, I'll shut up now. Go ahead.
Well, and what I want to do is I'm just going to spend 2 minutes presenting a little bit more information to say why 2023 was the year of AI.
Yes.
And then we can come back and hopefully open up the conversation to others as well. So, and there's a lot on this screen. I won't try to cover it all, but this is the year in which AI became ubiquitously available to anybody who has a smartphone to use directly, right? It's no longer the case that it's lurking in the background of your Google search or your Amazon purchase. It is there in the foreground on your devices for you to use. And it's generative. It's generating new original content that was never there before. I'm going to give an example real quick, an example I particularly like, which is that AI composed a new Chopin mazurka, right? And it was then brought to a conference of Chopin scholars and performed for them alongside an obscure Chopin piece. And they were asked, which one is the real Chopin? 60% of them voted for the piece composed by AI as being an authentic, obscure Chopin piece. And so when this technology can compose in the style of one of our great composers in a way that is so convincing that the experts on that composer think that it's him, right? This gives you a sense of the power of this technology. It's also machine learning. It's technology that is learning for itself. We no longer program this technology. It corrects its own mistakes. It learns in a way that's completely derivative from us, right? We tell it, that's a dog, that's a cat. Here are 100,000 dogs, 100,000 cats. You figure out the difference between them, but then it learns, it corrects its mistakes to the point where it calls all dogs dogs and all cats cats. And it is also now with large language models speaking in ways that in many instances seem to be basically indistinguishable from what humans say. And I just want to point to, I think, something Andy just referred to, which is sometimes called the black box problem, which is although we build this technology, we don't understand how this technology does what it does. We can't pry open the hood and look in it because it's calculations all the way down, and it's millions of calculations per second, and we just can't figure out what's going on. And if we could, it still wouldn't make sense to us. And yet, because it's working so well with large quantities of data, many people end up trusting it, even though they don't understand it. And I don't want to say we shouldn't trust it carte blanche, right? But we should be very careful not to substitute human judgment with sheer bulk computational power. And this is what Yuval Noah Harari calls dataism. And I think that that's a real danger. We're using AI to determine the sentence of convicted criminals, to make decisions about whether or not they come up for parole. I'm sorry, whether they get granted parole when they come up. And again, that is suspending our own judgment, substituting something we don't understand. It's clearly got some problems with things like racism, which it learns from us, but then it replicates because we do it. We should be better than that. I'll also point out very quickly, if we look at the evolution of AI, it is just galloping ahead, right? And so, right, it used to be a big breakthrough every 25 years. Now it's a big breakthrough every year or multiple times in the same year. It's smarter and better than us in a whole bunch of different ways. And the godfather of AI, Geoffrey Hinton, quit Google to be able to say out loud that he thinks this technology is a profound risk to our society and humanity. It clearly has tremendous benefits. It may help us cure Alzheimer's, cancer, Parkinson, and figure out what to do to pull carbon out of the atmosphere before we cook ourselves. But having said that, it also may very well undermine the factual basis of modern society, and experts suggest it has about a 10% chance of resulting in human extinction or permanent disempowerment. So that's just to give you a little bit of a sense of why I think 2023 might be the year of AI. Let's figure out what among those ideas do we want to talk about more.
Yes. So I am just worried that is AI sentient? That's why, or is it close to sentience?
I don't think so.
No.
What do you mean by sentient?
Can it be? Can it become aware of itself?
Self-conscious, aware, and
I
Aware of
disagree
itself?
that it's not possible for the capacity, the processing capacity which we have in computation, that the AI, no matter how intelligent it is, that it becomes sentient or conscious. That is a very different process. So I think the way you both have described it's very well expressed, the danger of AI and the need for regulation. But I think that there is another point to it, that who is going to regulate? Because whoever is going to control it is going to have an immense power over people, whether the companies do it or our elected representative do that, and we know, or our bureaucracy finds a way to do that. So whoever is going to control this genie is going to control the world. So it's a very, and I don't know the answer to that, but this is something which Andrew might like to speak about, that how to safeguard the controller even.
Well, that's
And I just want to pause for 1 second to say that's Dr. Hassan Asif for people who don't know him, who is a psychiatrist and does really interesting pioneering work in the way in which the brain operates, particularly at the level of neurobiology. So thank you for the question, Hassan. I'll be quiet. I'll let Andy answer.
It's It's a really great question. It's not, obviously, I mean, you put your finger on it. And part of the problem is we have wasted 30 years now in not thinking about this, not working on it, not regulating it, allowing the technology online to just develop like an amoeba, or like kudzu. And we therefore lack the systems, we lack the understanding, and we lack the knowledge. I think we have to start with the people. I think we have put that the people who run these companies have to be held accountable for their own behavior. And I agree with you, Hassan, that I don't think AI can become sentient, although that's the great fear of, Terminator and all of the science fiction movies, that AI suddenly becomes aware and realizes we're the problem and kills us. But it doesn't have to be aware to do damage, but the people are aware. They're human beings, and they're feeding the data into the AI, and they're doing it in a very deliberate way. They're not doing it to create Chopin. They're doing it to create massive advertising networks or political networks or whatever they are that are about making money. This is not about, this is not even about, I'm sorry, no, I've forgotten his name, who trained the computer to play chess and then he lost, but now the computer can win, right? It's not even about that. It's not even about, social experience and social engineering. It's a group of people who, I'm sorry, this sounds bigoted, and it is bigoted, I think are some of the worst people in our business world, just some of the absolute worst. They're amoral. They've been out of control for 35 years practically now. Some of them are literally mentally ill. And we're going to bring them into a room and ask them how to control them? No, I don't think so. I think what we have to do is limit it somehow in its use. We do not allow automatic weapons to be purchased by children, but we allow AI to be owned by children. And it makes absolutely no sense to me. How we get there, Hassan, is the huge question, right? Because we can't even agree on an electoral system in this country, right? In Europe, they have this giant union that can't agree on anything practically, except that they have a currency, right? But there is no political unity in Europe that I can see. And I don't live there, and maybe it's more apparent to people who live there. So that's a huge problem, And as long as we go, as long as we have, and if the United States is going to take a leading role on this, which I doubt, but let's say they were to, we have to get our own house in order. We are incapable of governing ourselves right now. And the idea that the people in Washington are going to be able to regulate AI in any kind of a sensible way that's going to help anybody in this room, I think is extremely small. So you really have I wish I had a better answer, but I happen to believe that the time for countries that are based on untenable notions of community and gender and identity and so-called race and all of this that are about 500 years old, that time has long passed. And just look at Europe. Europe is once again tearing itself apart over artificial borders that were put in place by some human being to take land away from some other human being 100 years ago.
So
so I think we have to have something like the EU. But and I'm going to say this, and they're going to. I think the UN is not any kind of institution that can help us at this moment. Period.
So
and I don't know.
If we come back to
or we can probably ask the AI to help us resolve the problem.
We could. Now let's remember who the first person to talk about AI was. Right, it was Mary Shelley with Frankenstein. This is not a new idea, right? And we have been joking about this for hundreds of years, and now it's here. I mean, science fiction writers and poets and novelists have been warning us about this for the beginning of time, right? And yet we act surprised.
So I want to just
surprised about a lot.
Come back to Sophia's question for a second. Is this sentient? And I want to say two things about it. And one of them is a little technical, right? AI right now is entirely sub-symbolic, right? What we are doing right now is we're using symbols, we're using words, right, to represent ideas. AI doesn't do that. AI reduces every word to a number and only functions by computationally mapping the numbers that represent the words that it has no idea what it means, right? So in some sense, I want to say the idea of sentience, yeah, it requires probably embodiment. It requires probably emotion. It certainly requires a symbolic level of communication. And AI has none of that right now. So I think we should be very careful. It is a very alien kind of intelligence that has been taught to mimic human intelligence, right? And so we have to be careful in thinking just because it talks like we talk, sounds like we talk, and I had that slide with the binary crying, right, when the woman was telling the story. Just because it can emulate emotion does not mean it has emotion. And what would human beings be without emotion? Psychopaths, right? I think one way to think about the answer to that question, without compassion, without empathy, we are very dangerous, right? Not that we aren't dangerous with it, but having said all that, I'm not sure it needs sentience to be dangerous, right?
Oh God, no.
It can have perhaps intention. It can have intention that may not align with our intention. It may even want to do what it thinks we want, but have means ends problems, not recognize that doing what we want to make sure we never run out of paper clips again does not involve totally degrading the environment or depriving us of food, etc. Right? That this is a classic example from the literature on AI. Just that it could be very dangerous to us, even if it doesn't have sinister intentions.
I wanted to ask, like, how is it? So AI can create like a really believable deepfake. And at some point, we will all, because it has studied features and everybody, like we're feeding our information into the social media and everywhere, wherever there are cameras. So it can create really believable deepfakes. And I don't know, you're right. I mean, deepfake without the emotion will be very difficult to, I guess.
But Sophia, somebody has to tell it to do that. We keep leaving the human beings out of this. AI is not currently an independent intellectual electronic entity, right? It's all owned and run by human beings, all of whom feed it data for specific purposes, then use that data for specific purposes, and not always for financial purposes, sometimes for nefarious ones, right? And so it's the human part of this that's a problem. And if we forget about the fact that, you know, the reason that AI is racist is because the people who teach it are racist. It's not that complicated.
The data that it draws on reflects the racism of human beings. Yeah, and
that's a nicer way of saying it. Yeah.
The deep fake issue, I think, is incredibly important, and it is, I think, all but inevitable. And I'll give an illustration that a week before this upcoming election, there will be a very convincing video of Joe Biden saying that, yes, Hunter Biden made a lot of money and he assisted him and he profited from Hunter Biden's nefarious criminal activity in the Ukraine. And Donald Trump was right about that, and he's laughing to the bank, having gotten away with it, right? That's the kind of thing that's inevitably coming down the pipeline, and we will have to brace ourselves for the results, which will be, again, right, as the ethical advisory boards to Google and Microsoft put it, undermining the factual basis for our civilization.
The ethical advisory boards to Google and Microsoft is one of the most ironic statements I've heard in a very long time, David.
Well, emphasis on advisory, because their advice was not taken. I think.
By the way,
go ahead, Hassan.
By the way, I have stopped believing in anything online, because I think we also should expect from our own selves. I think that we have some natural filter to filter out bullshit in a way. For example, nowadays, I don't believe in anything. I will give you a very, it's a funny example. The other day, I became a member of Elon Musk's fan club on Facebook. And then, it's something, and Elon Musk, supposedly it was his personal page, messaged me. And I said, wow. I mean, I was being naive at that time. And it happened only last week. And so we started talking, texting each other. I said, Elon, how come you have time to do this? You must be very crazy. He said, yeah, but I just liked your comments, and so I'm talking to you. Now, listen to this. He said, can I call you? I said, what? You want to call me? Why do you want to call me? He said, no, I just would like, I have a bunch of friends here and we are just experimenting with it. So here comes Elon Musk's call. Can you imagine? Now, it was Elon talking to me and I'm saying, you are crazy. I said, yeah, I am crazy. And so we had just a few minutes, and then he said, oh, I don't have time. Can you come? We can chat more if you can come to the Telegraph, and I can invite you on Telegraph. And that's when my whole thing, right? I said, this is scam. this is, and it was so real. It's like almost like I'm talking to you right now. So
So
I mean, this is a very good example of how you can be scammed. But also my initial point that we are going to stop believing in anything what we see online.
and the
It's
only
very
thing
dangerous.
I believe when I look at it online is something that I already believe, of course.
So,
Right,
so
right.
the very notion of truth is under threat here.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think we have to.
Okay, so the first one was that did we lose control of AI? I don't know if we have lost control yet, but the guy who founded OpenAI, didn't he lose control of his company at some point?
For
Yeah,
5
but he
minutes.
got for 5 minutes and he got it back. A personality dispute among the Uber nerds of America is not exactly a reflection of what's going on in society. You
And
know,
and I just want to point out something Ezra Klein pointed out. I think ultimately it was a little bit more complicated, and he corrected himself. But the CEO of OpenAI was fired by the board of OpenAI, and then he and every employee of OpenAI went over to Microsoft. And OpenAI realized that they would collapse as a company if they tried to fire their CEO. So they offered them all their jobs back. And then the whole board resigned. The board, by the way, it's a peculiar company, is supposed to regulate the for-profit subsection of OpenAI to keep it from doing bad stuff with this technology. And what it learned was they couldn't, right? They couldn't stop the for-profit portion of the company doing what it wants to do, because if they try to stop it, they'll all just go over to Microsoft, right? And so I do think lurking in the background of all of this is what I was calling the political economy of communication. It's the fact that all this stuff is owned by for-profit ventures, that those ventures hire armies of lobbyists, and that our political system is so broken that it listens to the lobbyists even when the lobbyists are telling them to do things that might very well jeopardize the future of humanity. That's how off kilter democracy is in the 21st century, and I'm not sure we should really be calling it democracy anymore. It's much more like plutocracy, rule by the rich, disguised as some mechanism for securing the consent of the masses. On that note, why don't we talk about something much less down and dire: climate change. Sophia and I just went for a nice New Year's Eve hike, and halfway through the hike, she handed me her coat because in New York right now, it's no longer 60 degrees, but it's still almost 50 degrees. And we were in our winter coats, and there's no real winter to speak of. By the way, that's the last day of the hottest year ever recorded. And going back in those ice cores, it looks like the hottest year in hundreds of thousands of years. And so the second question is climate change accelerating? And as you can see, the data that we have from 2023, hottest ever recorded months, right? And the hottest ever recorded year. One of the things I love about this diagram, the last time we had a month that was below the average temperature for the entire 20th century was in February of 1979, right?
Jesus.
For 45 years, all of our temperatures have been above average, and 2023 is way above where we've been for the last 5 years, right? So it looks like we may be really experiencing accelerating climate change. Is that the case? If so, what does that portend for the future? Andy, you want to share your thoughts on that again?
I am such a layman on this. I hope somebody here has more scientific knowledge than I do, which is not hard. But I think it's important for us to remember, first of all, this is not global warming, right? These are important trends, but some places are going to get colder. It's not like every place is going to become Miami Beach. It certainly feels that way, David, and it may be because we're paying a lot more attention to it. There's been a climate conference that really didn't do a whole hell of a lot, which wasn't shocking. And there's, you know, the younger generation, people who are now in their late teens and early 20s are crazy about this. I mean, this is, you know, one of their this is one of the things you hear about the most, which is, what are you going to guys do about this mess that you gave us? And there, it feels, since it was so hot, like it is accelerating. I don't know if that's statistically, scientifically true. That chart certainly seems to do, but I also think we've gotten very distracted from it, right? Climate change has gotten wrapped up in all kinds of pointless political debates that have nothing to do with climate change. We aren't very good at discerning real efforts to combat climate change from fake efforts to climate change. You know, real efforts being to try to cut down on the clear cutting of the Amazon, which provides most of our oxygen. Fake efforts at climate change, it's making electric cars for extremely rich people, and then shooting yourself into space and thereby creating a bigger carbon footprint than you ever saved ever, right? And we love, especially in the United States, we love these, you know, shiny toys, and we tend to get very excited about them. And so we've been talking about it a lot. If somebody here has more information, it looks like it's accelerating. I mean, based on these, but I just don't know. Is it?
When one part of the world starts getting warmer, then another part will, you know,
Yeah, I guess. I mean, and you know, I mean, look, I hate to keep going back to this, but I've been reading science fiction since I was born, practically. And Isaac Asimov predicted 70 years ago that the world would come to an end in a nuclear war between Sri Lanka and India over water. And does that sound shocking anymore? I mean, you know, in 1970, that might have sounded shocking. First of all, the idea that India would be a global power in 1970 sounded shocking, but it just doesn't sound shocking anymore. We now know that we're running out of water. You know, there was just a huge article in the New York Times about how Americans stopped eating beef and started eating chicken, and it turns out that chicken is worse than beef. So, you know, none of the decisions we make are based on this. And whenever somebody tries to implement a regime, you know, where investment decisions are also based on how it affects the specific environment and also how it affects climate change, it instantaneously becomes a fight over, are you a liberal woke person, or are you a real American, or are you a real French person, or are you real this, real that? And it's been so messed up with our political debate that we have to find a way of untangling that. Now I sound like I did about AI, which is we have to find a way of controlling it without having a good idea. But it does feel like it's getting more out of control. And I think it's getting more out of control partly because I kind of feel like people are paying less attention. You know, we're thinking about Ukraine. We're thinking about other things. You know,
Gaza.
Gaza. Yes, I'm trying not to use that word. I know we're going to get to it inevitably, but yeah. I'm not sure where they go, but you know, again, is it when they look back and they can say it was 2023 or was it 2027? I honestly don't know, but clearly we are in an up ramp at this moment. Look at just look at that black line. I mean, it's insane. You know, and
well, I
the
was
problem again is what Hassan identified is there's no truth anymore. So someone comes out and tells you to worry about it, and the other person says, nah, it's just the libs telling you that.
It's fake news.
Fake news.
And I want to say two things about this. I mean, I think one of them is that it's becoming harder to be a full-out denialist about climate change, right? And the issue is, you know, it's one thing to run around saying the sky is falling when there's no evidence. It's another thing when actual pieces of the sky start raining down on your head to deny that the sky is falling. And I think we're in the moment now where the wildfires, the choking smoke, the droughts, the heat waves, the hurricanes are coming with such frequency and such magnitude that it becomes harder to deny. And so the new form of denialism, I think, is not to deny that the climate is changing, but to deny that we're responsible for it, or to deny that it's as urgent as we think, as those of us who take the science seriously think it is. And so that might just be a baby step of progress. I'm going to focus very quickly, because then the other question is this accelerating? And I think the evidence that it's accelerating is pretty clear. The question is, so you can see right from 1880 to I think that's around 1970. There's one trend, and then from 1970 to the present, there's a second trend, and then the question is, from 2025 to 2050, will there be a third trend that'll be even steeper in its gradation of temperature increase? And the issue is, right, of course, that greenhouse gas emissions are still going up, that we're still cutting down the rainforest, but then also 2023 has what's called a natural forcing, which is El Nino, which is a naturally occurring ocean current trend. And as you can see, and I think this is really important to understand, the oceans have taken the bulk of the energy and heat generated by the greenhouse gases that we've put into the atmosphere. The diagram on the bottom left there, this shows the amount of energy absorbed by the oceans relative to the amount of energy absorbed by the atmosphere, right? And as you can see, what's been retained by the atmosphere, which in a sense is reflected in those heating graphs, is minuscule in comparison to what's been absorbed by the oceans. And I think one of the big worries is that 2023 is the year where the oceans reach their saturation point. Their capacity to absorb our retained solar energy has been exhausted. It's beginning to radiate back out into the atmosphere, right? That's speculative. We won't know the answer to that question probably for another 5 or 10 years. But please note, this is pretty much exactly what the climate change models predicted would be happening in 2023. And look where they predict we're going. And so in that sense, I guess I have to hope that the combination of the hottest year on record, ocean temperatures where basically you can't go in the ocean in Florida in July because it's like a hot tub. It starts to cook you, right? And all of these incredibly dangerous mega weather phenomena, right? That we put all of that together, and maybe people start to, pull the wool off their eyes and say, wait, there's something going on here that we have to pay attention to. I will just point out, and this goes back to what Andy said a moment ago about the recently concluded conference, COP28, that they actually agreed to some good things. They finally named the elephant in the room and said fossil fuel is the problem. They pledged to triple renewable energies, and they finally funded the loss and damage fund, something they've been talking about for a decade, giving poor countries some money to cope with the problems that the rich countries of the world have generated for them. The question, of course, is any of this meaningful, right? Because there's a long history of people going to these conferences, agreeing to do the right thing, and then coming home and not doing anything at all. So that seems to me, in a sense, where we stand in 2023 with climate change. Anybody else have comments or thoughts, remarks that they want to throw in onto the bonfire before we move on? I'm pushing us along because we have 2 more big topics and we're already an hour into this.
Wow.
Yes. I just want to add something, Sophia, just one little comment, that even all the answer which we have come up with so far regarding this, our energy consumption and the sources of it. So, for example, when we are going for electric cars and all these solar panels, if you really look at we've been charging our Teslas, right? You have Tesla. I recently got that. And so I got more into it, the where I'm getting my electricity from. So I did a little bit of research. And you know where it is coming from? For 56% of New York State, it comes from the coal burning in West Virginia. So they are producing electricity for our Tesla from the coal. So whatever we are doing is probably is not a solution, but more of a problem.
I'm not a statistician. I barely can, add, but how many trillions of Teslas have to be driven, how many quintillions of miles before they begin to have an impact on the energy consumption that went into making them? I don't know the answer to that, and nobody's ever really looked at it. And certainly the person who owns Tesla doesn't care, so he's not going to be the way.
We are probably doomed.
Well, there is that.
Don't.
I have a 27-year-old son who's always talking about late-stage capitalism, and one day I said to him, "So, Gabriel, what comes after late-stage capitalism?" And he said, "Armageddon, Dad."
So they're already ready for that.
That's our third question about the Armageddon.
Armageddon.
The old and new wars to lead
Is
us.
that what we're coming to next?
Yes, that's I think that's the next one.
So Hassan, just so you know, New York State passed a law that requires that 70% of its electricity by 2030 come from renewables and 100% by 2040. And so in a sense, this helps a little bit to answer Andy's question: how long does it take, right? And let's assume that you were going to buy a car, right? And so probably the best thing you can do, I drive a 20-year-old gas guzzling pickup truck, right? And I think I can make an environmental argument for doing that because I didn't buy a new car in the last 20 years, right? And in a sense, the best thing we can do is just keep driving our old vehicles. But if you're going to buy a new vehicle, recognize that the Tesla takes more energy to make. And by the way, there's some really problematic stuff that goes on with getting the minerals that go into the batteries. That's another story. But that if you're going to hold on to it for 5 or 10 years, both the environmental impact of driving the car and the electrical supply that powers the car is going to be worth the initial investment, environmentally speaking. At least that's my understanding of where we're going.
By the way, as long as we're talking about Tesla, let's talk about AI. One of the greatest commercial failures of AI in our time is the so-called auto-driving Tesla, which we now know isn't even true.
Yeah. Oh.
I mean, their defense in the court cases is, they didn't read to the end of the user's manual, or they would have found out that everything we told them before was just nonsense.
Yeah.
It's human beings that are the problem, not machines. It's human beings. And everything about Tesla is run by a human being who, in my own personal opinion, is totally out of control. But that's not what this is about.
So what is it about human beings which make us so gullible and vulnerable and self-destructive? I think we need to talk about it, because I think most of the problem we will find out that it's coming back to the human being, our very nature.
Well, we have to look at
what exactly is it.
I mean, what is the moral fabric of American society in the 21st century? I would defy you to tell me what it is. I would defy you to tell me what it ever was, but let's pretend that at one time there was a moral fabric. We are, and if you just look at this country, having morals, having decency, having a real ideology, having intellectual consistency, and telling the truth are no longer values that are worth or prized in America anymore.
And I think Hassan was asking, in a sense, an even deeper question, right? And so it's not just America.
No, it's not. It's everywhere.
Europe, China, India. What is the moral fabric of human society in the 21st century, or what do we use to orient? And I'm reading this wonderful book right now, Capitalism Alone by Branko Milanovic, and so Milanovic, who's this a really amazing economist, argues that there's the triumph of capitalism, which now rules China and India, as well as the United States and Europe. And basically, he says there's no place in the world today that you can go where people don't understand the profit motive or the desire to spend less for a consumer good. And that's a huge triumph for capitalism, right? Because that means that for the first time in human history, there's a universal value proposition that everybody understands. And so that's the moral compass of the 21st century. It's not much of a compass and it's not very moral, right? But having said that, I also want to point out we are evolved creatures, right? And we are primates, and we are evolved for a certain setting, right? Our capacity to solve problems, our emotions, our morals evolved for very small, technologically stationary tribal societies, right? And we live in societies that have hundreds of millions of persons in them that therefore are no longer tribal. With technology that's galloping out of control, we need to learn to disregard so much that is so deeply ingrained in the way that we think if we're ever going to have a chance to survive. And I think it's, it's a long shot proposition. It's why I started the conversation by saying, if there are human beings and historians 100 years from now, because I think probably this is the first time in human history we can say the likelihood of extinction is greater than the likelihood of survival measured in the short term, 100 years. But if we're going to do it, we're going to have to get past all this stuff that is so natural to us, but is so problematic given how we live in the 21st century. On that note, I'm going to keep trying to push us ahead. I have one more piece of good news on climate change, which I know I'm just a font of optimism and happy ideas. Let me share this last little bit, which is, by the way, part of the reason that the world can pledge to triple its reliance on renewable energy in the next 6 years, that New York is pledging to have 70% renewable by 2030, is because renewable just got really cheap and really efficient, and battery prices have come way down. And part of the reason that happened is because the governments of the world, especially the US, Europe, and China, started subsidizing the development of this technology around 15 years ago. And by the way, with this recent legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, we're subsidizing it again. So there may be more big breakthroughs, which may make this stuff cheaper and more profitable, and might just allow us to align that one universal value system, capitalism, with our need to save the planet by addressing climate change.